The African Union holds a summit as the continent's troubles only grow. From wars to disease to poverty, the AU's effectiveness is being questioned. Well, is the African Union failing to meet expectations, or is too much being asked of it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. The 24th African Union Summit kicked off in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa on Friday with delegates from more than 50 member states. The plan was to discuss gender equality and sustainable development across Africa. But the African Union's overall purpose is much wider. Its goal is to protect human rights, defend African positions on international issues, and bring the continent together on social and economic topics. Well, over the last decade, Africa has been involved in a whole host of military and political disputes that fall under the AU's jurisdiction. And some of those issues have gone unresolved or even grown worse. Critical voices point to security as a major challenge, for example, confronting the AU. In Nigeria, Boko Haram has wreaked havoc on the civilian population. Amnesty International says at least 4,000 people have been killed. A Hutu rebel group in the Democratic Republic of Congo has repeatedly failed to lay down its arms. The United Nations finally launched an offensive against them in January, but the African Union's standby forces haven't taken part. And many human rights groups have criticised the AU for failing to release its report on crimes against humanity in South Sudan. They say that without the report, it's hard to hold anyone accountable. Let's get the thoughts of our guests now. Joining us from Nairobi is Dismas Mokua, Deputy President of AfricaErastus, a consultancy firm on doing business in Africa. In London, Michael Amoah, Research Associate at the Centre of African Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And joining me here in the studio is Studies.Thembisa Fakude, researcher at the Jazeera Centre for Studies. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Let's first, though, go over to Mr. Erastus Mwencha. He's the Deputy Chairman of the African Union. He's joining us over the phone from Addis Ababa. Good to have you with us, sir. I know it's been a busy few days for you at the African Union Summit there in the Ethiopian capital, but perhaps you could bring us up to speed with how much progress is being made to adopt the first 10-year plan of Agenda 2063, the African Union's development vision for Africa. Has that now finally been adopted?
Yes, the Agenda 2063 has been adopted, and one feature about Agenda 2063 is the broad-based consultations that have taken place in the documents that were extremely inclusive, giving the Africans overall information to express and indicate their aspirations and to design the Africa they want. Beyond that, this report also contains what we call flagship projects, including, for instance, high-speed rail, having a common single space in the continent, fast-tracking the continental free trade area, moving forward free movement of people in the continent. And out of this, the leaders have also worked out the strategy for its financing, which has also looked at various schemes in the continent, and which would, of course, make sure that this Agenda 2063 is implementable.
Well, how do you respond then, sir, to those who are worried, who are concerned that not enough groundwork has been done when it comes to economic reforms, enough investment in human capital, integration, for example, some of those issues, in order for you to put a development agenda and meet its goals?
Well, if you look at what you call economic agenda in the continent, first of all, in the last decade, Africa actually has been the frontier that has been growing. With an average growth rate of about 5%, no other continent has been achieving this growth rate except Africa. And that is informed by the reforms that Africa has put in place. It is also informed by Africa's capacity now to start owning its own processes. Africa is now starting to move up the ladder in terms of value addition. In other words, we that is flowing in the continent, we see industrialization finally starting to take root, and the measures that leaders have taken here, for instance, fast-tracking the continental free trade area, is not just in theory, because we have seen it already in regional economic community. If you look at work that has been done under SADC, the work that has been done under the tripartite, that is the COMESA, East African Community and SADC, to move towards a tripartite free trade area, which will be honest to be.
Okay. If I could also ask you, sir, if I could also ask you about security. The African Union is sometimes criticised as not being as effective as it could be when it comes to intervention in conflict zones. What's happened to the African Standby Brigades initiative? Is that force ready to be deployed now?
Well, let me begin by saying that some of the criticism is really stereotype. I mean, the old broken song that continues to say that without looking at reality on the ground. 10 years down the road, conflict is significantly. Africa now has in place an architect, the African Peace and Security Architect, that responds. We have put on the ground boots, for instance, in Somalia, in Central Africa, in Mali, that change the picture. We also realize our shortcomings, for instance, the case of Mali, Central Africa, because we didn't have a rapid response mechanism. Africa has now moved to set up what we call Africa's rapid response capacity, which is called a creek, which is also now going to be able for us to move quickly. And in any case, the point that you referred to about the standby force, for instance, the East African standby force has now said they are ready, so that in future, if there is a challenge in East Africa, we now have a standby force. So you can say in terms of actual conflict, in terms of numbers that were there 10 years ago, and now significant expression, yes, still continue to conflict, but you should also look at the graph, what is happening. And so I can assure you that this is a matter that assumes high priority in the circles of the African continent, and you will continue to see effort in that direction.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Erastus Mwencha there, the Deputy Chairman of the African Union. Let's take the discussion into our studio here. Thembisa, is the African Union setting the continent's security agenda? Some would say you often look at conflict zones and the people who are playing the major role, the dominant role, sometimes are foreign troops.
Yeah, well, they're not setting up any security agenda. It's set out from outside. And unfortunately, AU relies a lot on regional powers to determine security agendas, and to an extent that cripples its effectiveness. If you look, for example, the struggle or the efforts against Boko Haram are all left to the original power that is led by Nigeria, of course, as is expected. But nothing has happened, and the AU can't really even impose itself on the regional powers to try and push the forces of Boko Haram from continuing committing the havoc that they're committing at the moment in West Africa.
It is a sad situation and state of affairs. Michael Amoah in London, how much of the African Union's efforts to intervene and set the security agenda, to intervene in conflicts, is held hostage to African politics, to the state of leadership in Africa and the state of governance?
Well, exactly as you've just said. Well, they've been telling us so far that the African Standby Force will actually achieve full operational capacity in 2015. Well, here we are in 2015. Today is only 31st January, so we have 11 months to go, and soon they will run out of excuses. But the main thing really is that even when the Rapid Reaction Force or the Standby Facility comes into full operation, there will not be enough to tackle the so many conflicts on the continent. And the reasons for the continent, as we all know, is because of bad governance and, well, it's simply bad governance. There are too many heads of states wanting to stay around for too long. And even when the constitutions want them to leave office, they want to remain. And I think that the African Union needs to be realistic and be able to make sure that heads of states are not abusing the constitutions. And that's when the conflicts will stop. Otherwise, we will be wasting our time.
But if they're not giving enough resources, I think is what you're saying, there's not going to be enough troops, there's not enough resources. Why is that? Is there a lack of conviction on the part of African leaders as to the importance of the AU and the standby force?
No, it's just because the conflicts are too many on the continent, and they're also on very large scales, which really demand quite a lot of military capability on the ground and in the air to be able to tackle all those. That said, there are also potentially more ticking time bombs. There are more ticking time bombs than there are conflicts at the minute. There are at least some 12 countries on the continent where we know for certainty that if the heads of state will want to continue the way they're going, that in the next 12 months, 14 months, 3 years, there are going to be conflicts because the people, the citizens will not stand for it. And I think strategically, the African Union has to think realistically about how to make sure that these heads of states are actually doing the right things to ensure good governance.
That's an
and
interesting...
that's really where the African Union needs to...
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'd like to take Dismas Mokua up on it. The expectation, when you listen to people like Michael Amoah in London, there is an expectation that the AU needs to be doing more to oversee what African leaders are doing. But the AU, of course, is made up from the support of African leaders and African countries. Are we expecting too much from a continent which is plagued with problems such as coups, problems with its own democracy, problems with the strength of its institutions, and sometimes even distrust between leaders and their own national armies?
Well, for me, from where I'm seated, I see our biggest challenge in Africa is really respecting institutions. Because when you talk about the Africa Union, the people who are meeting up at Addis Ababa and are trying to really focus on where Africa should be going, probably 50% of them are dictators. They've not gone through office through a democratic election. And my view would be that for Africa Union to be relevant, it must have sanctions on some of the leaders who want to cling to power without any democratic means. And as indicated earlier on in the conversation, we need to have all-inclusive democracies.
If they do that, how many
the
African leaders will be
up.
left as members of the AU? Wouldn't that get the organization into a bigger problem?
Well, no, for me, I would imagine that in as much as probably up to maybe 70% of them have gone through office through other means which are not democratic, but at least we can start somewhere. Because the only reason why you'd have a conflict, say, in Nigeria, in DRC, in Burundi, is because of lack of inclusivity. That when an individual takes office, whether or not there is a constitution, they don't respect the constitution, like what you see happening at DRC. The president wanting to change the constitution to extend his term limits. That's a source of conflict. So for me, I think the Africa Union, with the few leaders who've gone through a democratic process, they form a critical mass, and they should start imposing sanctions on their colleagues who want to steal elections, who have no respect for democracy. Because unless you do that, then essentially you've got a club of old guys, and for you to get admitted, you must steal an election. People will no longer respect the Africa Union unless, Mr. Mwencha has indicated, they start imposing sanctions on those who organize coups, those who steal elections, and those who govern not through the will of the people. Like we've got a number of countries, like Kenya has gone through a very good transition. You've got a country like Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Botswana. These are the countries which can come forth and come up in a very strong position and say, we will expel you. And when you're being expelled from the Africa Union, it's not just supposed to be merely a statement that we've expelled you. The expulsion must come with sanctions so that if somebody steals an election or if somebody is running a government which is not all-inclusive, they know there's a penalty which is going to affect him as an individual and not the entire nation.
Thembisa, as we know, one of the African Union's goals is actually to protect human rights, perhaps to deal with some aspects of democracy, which our guests are talking about here today. But often, is that role or that mission complicated by the sort of colonial history and the fact that some of those issues are also championed by countries which have a colonial legacy in Africa, and that always complicates the argument about whether there is some sort of sub-agenda to the human rights mission, a sort of sub-colonial agenda going on?
Well, many of the...
Is that an excuse or a reality?
Well, it's an excuse. I think many of the leaders or member states in the African Union are themselves involved in restricting certain basic freedoms in their own countries. We're talking, for example, one who was welcomed by all over the past couple of days, Abdel Fattah Sisi, for example, from Egypt. You have Robert Mugabe, you have King Mswati, and the rest that are part of the African Union. So we cannot continue blaming the past. I think the African leaders themselves need to start showing leadership. And they can start at home. They can start from their own respective countries.
You mentioned some countries? What about, you know, Zimbabwe, for example, when you have powerful countries in the world who are pushing for a certain approach on human rights, and the local response is often that the countries pushing for this are really only seeking to push their own colonial interests. There may be real human rights concerns here, but that's not what's really the dispute, the international dispute and push is really all about.
Well, at the end of the day, the human rights are basically understood by all. There are certain things that we all appreciate, and based on the Human Rights Charter of 1945, and that's what we need to try and pursue and encourage as Africans. And we have seen the unwillingness from many African leaders from doing that. There's been a rigging of elections. Some of them overstay their welcome in power. We've had president, for example, like Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, who has clamped down on lots of basic freedoms in that country. So it is a challenge, and it's all up to the Africans at the moment to ensure that they turn the page into a new way of trying to improve the situation of Africans in that continent.
All right, well, it's not all about politics, is it? Let's take a look at some of the social issues plaguing Africa. According to the Brookings Institute, for example, the number of African children registered for school has been dropping in recent years. Right now, more than 32 million African children of primary school age are not in class. And of those who go to primary school, fewer than 10% actually make it to college. The average life expectancy in Africa is 60 years. That's 10 years less than the global average. 358 million people in Africa do not have immediate access to clean drinking water. And the average per capita annual income in sub-Saharan Africa is about $765 compared to the global average of $10,000. Let me take some of those points, if I may, to Dismas Mokua once again. We heard there from the AU official that the development plan of the African Union, the so-called Agenda 2063, has been adopted. Are you excited about that?
Well, literally, there is no cause for excitement. And in my view, what the African Union needs to do is really to focus a lot of energy on trade. Because, I mean, what is going to really assist Africa is intra-Africa trade. Kenya needs to engage in more trade activities, say, with Nigeria. And that way, you're able to create prosperity for all. Merely producing documents at Addis Ababa will not assist Africa. Because, you know, AU has been around for a long time. They keep on producing papers every single time they have a meeting. And there's nothing to write home about. So really what the African Union should be doing is probably borrow a leaf from the European Union and encourage trade between Africa. That way, then you get to lift people from poverty in probably within 20 years, you'll be able to do that. But if you just come up with papers, that will not happen. Like, for instance, we have the East African community, and the people within the region are able to trade. But if the political leaders in Addis Ababa are able to remove all the barriers to make freedom of, to create the movement of the factors of production a little more easy, then at that stage you'll be able to address all the social issues. But if you just produce a paper and when the leaders go back home, they don't spend any energy on trying to implement the Addis Ababa agenda, then we are actually shooting in the dark. And this has been said times above number. Wherever leaders come to Africa, they tell us that what we need to focus on is really intra-Africa trade. And that's what is going to save Africa, not those many papers produced. Because as soon as the presidents leave Addis Ababa, they'll forget about those protocols.
Michael Amoah, how much of the AU's resources actually go towards measures to improve, to reform the trade and business and investment climate and regulations in African countries?
Well, I mean, the AU has quite a lot of measures in place now to be coordinating trade and development across member states. What we really need to see is that this particular 26.3 agenda is such that each country's development plan has some sort of connectivity to this broader continental agenda in terms of trade and other things like that. And of course, there is the international aspect whereby the continent needs to trade with other, big states abroad, Europe, United States, elsewhere. But I think it's essential that the African Union needs to have the clout to be able to coordinate and also to be able to deal with inconsistencies, or actually the things which are deterrents to development. Because if you're talking about sustainable development, if there is political instability, there's no way that development can take place across the board.
So, Michael, what you're basically, forgive me for interrupting, what you're basically calling for is some strong sort of EU Brussels-style institutions, perhaps a court, perhaps a commission that has the ability to override national decisions should they impeach upon the principles of the AU. Well,
give and take some of it here or there. I mean, not exactly, because national institutions have to function. Let's not forget that the AU itself is inefficient when it comes to, certain things. So there are some countries who will not entrust their local development in the hands of the African Union. So just like any other institutional development, it will take a while for some sort of, clear impact to take place. But I think that one key issue here is that the African Union doesn't have the clout to ensure that the deterrents to development are handled properly, because as we speak, right, all the Francophone countries have signed military pacts with old colonial France, so that if their presidents are in trouble, then France has to send troops to come and rescue the person. And because of that, that is an incentive to governing with impunity. Heads of state of Francophone countries govern with impunity all the time. And because of that, there's always trouble in the Francophone countries.
Right, right.
And the African Union...
Okay, we just got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to give I think you made that point clear. Thembisa, let's not forget the important challenge of investment in human development, human resources. Hasn't Ebola highlighted the problem of Ebola? It's highlighted how much hasn't been done when it comes to healthcare infrastructure, education infrastructure, and so on and so forth.
Yes, indeed. And if we look at the priorities on where investment is made in Africa, it leaves one with a very big question on where is this agenda of investment dictated from. If we don't invest on basic essential services, and we're talking about fast speed trains that will link certain cities, for me it sounds it sounds as if our priorities are not really straight or directed towards the real issues that we should be tackling in Africa. Ebola has been an embarrassment for the AU, which has lacked leadership, and have not shown any visible leadership in tackling the challenges of Ebola.
One stat I read as well was 60% of the unemployed in Africa are young adults. That was according to the African Economic Outlook. That's surely a big challenge that you think the AU would really need to face up to.
Oh yeah, of course. And again, if you look at the priorities of investment in Africa, it makes one wonder, where is the agenda dictated from? Because if you're really concerned about your people, you should be looking at things like basic health services, education, but instead we're looking at things like military, for example, empowering our military forces in Africa and investing on fast-speed trains, which I don't think the Africans are really in need of that. We need to invest more on basic services and improving the lives of our people before we can look at these other sophisticated...
All right. We are out of time, so we're going to have to leave the discussion here. Let's thank our guests, Thembisa Fakude here in the studio, Dismas Mokua and Michael Amoah. And of course, thank you for watching the show. If you have anything to add, head over to our programme page on aljazeera.com, or you can post comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and all the team, it's goodbye for now.